Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Calmcast. This is the first ever episode of the Calmcast, which is essentially not necessarily a regurgitation of the blog. I want to make that clear right here, just establish that right up front. This is going to be more taking the topic of this week's blog, the blog of February 18th, to be an ally of equality, and opening it up to a discussion with someone who accurately represents the topic of the blog, which is the guest that we have here today, Miss Charity Wright, aka Mom. She is my mother, but she is also a very adamant ally of the LGBTQ community. We can all see her shirt. Um, and she has been wonderful and so supportive with me in my journey. So I think it's only fair that she be one of the first guests on the show because I wouldn't be here without her. So I'm really happy to have you on today. How are you doing?
I am doing okay, and I am excited to be a part of this new adventure with you.
I am so excited about this too. So today, as I already said, the name of the blog that we're going to be kind of more elaborating on, kind of just discussing and having some open and honest conversation about is going to be an ally of equality. This was written by me, not one of our guest writers, so this is something very personal to me. And to kind of start off, just to kind of preface, is it preface or is it preface? I can't. It's preface? Okay. Interestingly enough, I'm a writer and a podcaster, and I don't know words. So I love that about myself. Really accepting, we accept flaws here. So the definition of an ally that most people recognize, right,
Mm,
um, would be a non-LGBTQ person who actively supports the LGBTQ community and those within it.
mhm.
Um, Obviously, this is not an extensive definition, which is why we are here today to talk about the importance of allies, who they really are, what it means to be a true ally, and what false allyship looks like, and how to spot it, and certain examples. So I'd like to start off with asking kind of you more of an open-ended question. Besides the definition that I gave, from what you were able to gather from personal experience and the blog that you read this morning, how would you define allyship?
Well, I loved how you defined it in the blog, being an advocate, but not a voice that drowns out, those in the LGBTQ community. Um, my personal definition for it would be being a good friend, being there for those in the LGBTQ community, listening, repeating that message, getting the word out there, being a safe space with no judgment and no inappropriate questions, and just open dialogue and support. That's what I think of when I think of the word ally. Mhm.
That is a great definition and kind of just rolls us in to something that I wanted to really focus on, which is not drowning out other voices. That is a main part of being an ally because allyship allies play a significant role, right, in the development of our basic human rights. As the as a person of the LGBTQ community, I'm very thankful for advocates who were allies of the community in the past because without them, we would probably not be where we are today. And there was once a time where it was necessary for them to be louder than us because we were being silenced, whether it be through laws,
Mhm.
government policy, fear, in general, of hate crimes. But now we are much more open and we don't need to lean so much on allies to get the message out. We more need them to play the role of the supporter. And that's definitely not to say that they shouldn't be outspoken and that they shouldn't advocate for the message. It's just more of kind of an example I used in the blog they should be supporting someone who wants to be a president, you know, someone who's lesbian and wants to be a president. They should not try and, you know, not support, like run against the lesbian president, you know, it'd be stealing, you know, like maybe don't do that. Like if you support the president who's a lesbian, which, oh my God, like imagine how great that would be. We have some time until we get there, but it's going to be amazing and it's going to happen. But they can never be the lesbian president. They can only support her. And that is the most important part that I feel like a lot of people get wrong about allyship, is to not step over the boundaries. And I worry that that kind of feels like that would discourage people from being allies because they're afraid of overstepping. How would you say you've dealt with maybe fears related to not knowing your place in the community?
Okay, so that's a good question. I would want to provide some background first, but so I was raised by a Pentecostal preacher and had a very Christian upbringing. And so I was pretty sheltered. And my first real conversations about LGBTQ happened when, you know, beyond high school. Actually, when I was 20 or 21, I ran into an old high school friend of mine when I was working at a restaurant. And I realized then in conversation with him that he is gay. And I had so many questions because we had actually been, I guess, going out or whatever, like in the 7th grade. And you don't really go out in the 7th grade, right? Especially when you're a preacher's kid. But, you know, he would carry my books to class and this and that. And finally, you know, I asked him, and I was the one and only girl he ever dated, you know, understandably. I'm from, you know, Gen X. And so while there was progress for LGBTQ during my upbringing, it feels like it has started to accelerate with the millennials and Gen Z. You know, when I was growing up, and I hate to say that, it makes me sound so old, but when I was no one talked about it. And if you were gay or lesbian, you know, you didn't tell people. And to be honest, when I was growing up, I only knew about the word gay and I didn't really understand it. So here I was, 21 years old, trying to ease into that conversation. And anyone who knows me knows that I don't have the best filter on my mouth or my face. And I do tend to, I don't want to say be nosy, but I have a lot of questions. I want to understand things. And I don't, because of my upbringing, I didn't know the difference between what was appropriate or inappropriate. And I knew that I wanted to be friends with my old school friend again. And so like that friendship happened and I went to my first gay bar, and that was an intense experience being heterosexual female. It was a great experience though. And I kept going back and I learned more and I would start to speak more and ask more questions and learn what was appropriate and not appropriate. And then just from there on throughout the years, I just slowly learned like, okay, I don't have to be afraid to ask my question, but I do need to think about my question first. It's perfectly okay for me to be friends with whatever race, gender identification, religion, whatever. And I've always been a pretty open-minded person. And I have personally wanted to be accepted for who I am. So I try to put that back out in the world, if that makes sense. And so just my journey as an ally, it's been really long. It's been over 20 years. And I've had to learn a lot along the way, and I have made missteps. But I think the ultimate pivoting point for me personally was having a child, having children, trying to figure out their own sexuality and gender identification. And, knowing that as a mother, I wanted to fully support my child no matter what. And my child needed to always know that they were loved unconditionally. But it also meant I needed to learn about LGBTQ from a different perspective. Like, if I became more protective. And I think that's when I would view myself as an active ally, is when those years started, when we had those discussions. And then I realized, man, while it's not as hateful, I don't think, in the world today as it was back then, there's still so much hate, and there's still so much putting people in a corner and trying to make them be things that they're not, or people that they're not. And that made me sad. It made me sad for my children, because that's not the kind of world that I wanted, my kids to go out and be a part of. But you can't protect your kids from everything. So I figured the best way that I could learn how I could protect my children was to actually get educated. And I know you and we've had really great conversations when I've had questions about myself, or about how other certain individuals identify, and what does that mean. And, like I said, when I was growing up, I heard the word gay, but there are so many more identifications now than what I grew up hearing. So I appreciate that we have that conversation, because I feel like education ultimately dispels the fear. And I feel like I'm talking too much and maybe doing the exact thing, but that I should not be doing. But I'm not trying to speak over the community. I'm just, I guess, trying to say it can be a tough journey, learning how to become an appropriate and an effective ally. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I agree. And I think you made some good points, especially when a sticking point for me when you were speaking was you said, I realized that I didn't have to be afraid to ask questions, but you said something along the lines of, I don't have to be afraid of asking questions. I just need to think about how I'm going to ask them. And that would be some advice for the listeners. If you are an ally and you don't know how to approach a question, definitely first things first is, if you think it's inappropriate, it probably is. So take that with a grain of salt. But maybe you're just overly cautious and overly protective of what you say, and you don't want to hurt people's feelings. So maybe just think on it some, and don't be afraid to ask questions, because most people, like you were saying, there is a lot of hate in the world, but most people, especially people in the LGBTQ community, unfortunately are used to being asked inappropriate questions. But they're also used to correcting people nicely. The first confrontation you have should not be someone yelling at you for making a mistake. That is that person's problem, and that does not reflect on you. Even if someone was to intentionally ask me an inappropriate question, I would respond calmly, just like be calm. And to any people in the community listening as well, something we can take from what Charity just said is, people may ask offensive questions out of ignorance and not hate. So be kind and be patient with allies and aspiring allies. So that was a very good point that you brought up, and thank you for bringing it up. And it's definitely a long journey. Another talking point that you mentioned was learning through that journey and that continued learning. I feel like with anything that deals with morality, social justice, social issues, is a continuous learning process because
Mhm.
society will continue to grow. Norms will continue to change. Things that were acceptable in the 1920s would never be acceptable now in mainstream culture. So you can't ever be stagnant in your learning. And that's something that allies should incorporate into their maybe not daily lives, but maybe their weekly lives or their monthly lives, and check up on things like learning terminology. Can you define what asexual means? Do you know what pansexual means? There are so many more identities than, gay, lesbian, straight, and bisexual. And most people actually really don't fall in, one extreme or the other. Like, I only like this gender. I only like this gender. So that would, another thing to really focus on is just to start out is immerse yourself in that terminology and then be open-minded to somebody who's like, I don't feel like I go by any terminology and I just don't want to be labeled. Don't take that as, they're being confused or they don't want to disclose to you, because some people really struggle with labels. So just know that there's always more to learn. You can never learn enough. So take it
Mhm.
easy on yourself, but also be proactive and an active supporter. So it's finding that happy medium in that learning. Something else that I think is important for allies to be learning and be knowledgeable of is staying informed with policies and bills that affect the LGBTQ community,
Mhm.
especially in terms of education and mental health care. Me and you were actually just having a discussion about the bill in Florida. I love the
Mm.
Diet Coke can.
Yeah.
I love that. No, for real. Honestly, it's me. It's me. It's my manifestation. Yep. Diet Coke is an ally. Anyways, they're qualified. So where was I? I got so off track. Right. The Don't Say Gay bill happening in Florida. It's the informal name. I don't know the number. Sorry that I don't know the number, but you can just look up Don't Say Gay bill if you're listening to this in February through April of 2022, I think, would be a good time frame that this bill would be extremely relevant to kind of be knowledgeable on. And I'm not going to go into that whole thing because that's not what we're here for. But if you'd like some homework and you'd like some place to start, look at that bill. So you know that that's the kind of things you need to be staying updated on. And for a little fun history lesson, look up the history of LGBTQ people, because knowing the social background is a huge prerequisite to understanding the struggles that the LGBTQ community goes through. Knowing about significant figures such as Matthew Shepard, Marsha P. Johnson, um, Harvey Milk, the list goes on. So, and that can be some fun things to learn about. There's some good Netflix documentaries about it as well. So there's actually The Life and Death of Marsha P. Johnson. We'll recommend that if you want a nice documentary over the weekend when you got some downtime. So, and if you're really studious, if you really want to get involved, you can do what I do in my spare time, which is really research into topics like minority stress theory and internalized homophobia and systematic discrimination. These are heavy topics. They're not for everybody, and they take real dedication and passion to really learn and understand. Just like you can't really casually know, no one casually knows something about Star Trek, right? Like, if
Right.
you know something about Star Trek, you know
You're a
Star
Trekker.
Trek.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. It's kind of the same thing when you get more in depth in research. It's not something you can casually do, and it's not something you should take lightly because you need to make sure your sources are accurate, which is something else that will be discussed in part 2 of this episode, which is the role of an advocate and an ally being to spread reliable and relevant information. But that's for part 2. So that will be coming out soon. And that means we will not be discussing that topic in this episode, but stay tuned. And something else that we haven't brought up that I want to broach the topic of, because it can sound quite harsh, is the fact that the third main job of being an ally to the community is to be humble and to never become self-righteous. Little, public service announcement, being an ally is about the LGBTQ community and supporting them. It is not meant to, your goal shouldn't be to receive praise, to feel good about yourself. It should not be something that you do just to, say, get a, what would you call it? Like a badge of honor in that way, like a gold star. Like, it's not something that you can do. Do you have something you'd like to kind of add to that in terms of being self-righteous, not being self-righteous, excuse me, and to be humble? What advice would you give people to do that?
Yeah, so I think, it boils down to having the right motivation in whatever you're doing in your life. So as an example, yesterday, I got maybe a little too upset about something that was said. And I wanted to come to the defense because it was very anti-LGBTQ conversation. And I was like, nah, I ain't having that. So, I responded. The response I got back, they didn't receive what I was saying well, even though I wasn't being opinionated. I was presenting facts. Sometimes people are just not going to see eye to eye. But in this conversation, the individual indicated like what they had done for someone in the past to show support. And, that is honestly a form of gaslighting when you're looking to be thanked again or appreciated, or I don't know what the word is. It felt like the original act of support was disingenuous. And coming from a place of, yes, I want to do that for this person, but ultimately it makes me feel good about myself because I did that for that person. When you are supporting someone, regardless of what it is, if you're an ally for LGBTQ, if you're supporting someone going through a cancer struggle, or, just various examples, whatever you do, it should be out of selfless motivation, not what am I going to gain by supporting, this group or this community or this person. It should be, how can I make their lives easier, better, happier? How can I alleviate some stress? How can I take something on so they don't have as many, I don't know, as much pressure, as many responsibilities. In other words, it should be outwardly focused and not about getting something in return. Not exactly relatable, but, our conversation this morning, when you thanked me for something and I said, you don't need to thank me. I wanted to do that. I appreciate the thank you. That's kind of my point, right? We should not be an ally to get thanks. We should not do anything really in our life for someone else just to get the thanks, just so we can hold it over someone's head later. That makes it incredibly disingenuous and artificial. And you're really selling yourself short if that is the motivation behind it. Oh, I feel good being at this rally. Look at me, being a part of something. Are you a part of it though, if that is the feeling that you're focused on? So I think an example that I could give is when we went to Pride. It was my first time being at Pride, and I was a little nervous because I wanted to make sure I didn't look at anyone in a way that they might perceive, as negative, even though I wasn't thinking anything negative. I might have had questions, but I would certainly not walk up to a stranger and ask a question. And you and I had great dialogue when we were at Pride. And, it felt like a safe environment to be in. And I did feel like I belonged, but only to a degree. And that's appropriate because I don't fully belong to the LGBTQ community. I'm there to support. So it's okay for me to feel like a little bit of an outsider. I should, because I'm there to support. I am not that community. I am not that person. I guess that's how I kind of viewed that. I had a great time. I loved everybody that I met. I left feeling good that we went, but more so because you had a good time and because members of the LGBTQ community were having a good time.
It was a party.
It was,
It was
like
such a party.
I loved watching the drag show. Remember, I made you stop. So I was like, ooh, they're going to do the drag show. I want to see that. Like, I have so much respect for the work that goes into doing that. And entertainment value, the singing and everything. It's awesome. But yeah, so I guess to wrap that up, I would say that our motivation, we should always question our motivation just as human beings in general, whatever we're doing. But to be an effective and I think useful ally, you definitely got to make sure your motivation is correct. Like, check yourself. So
that's great. Yeah. And certainly a lot of that maybe self-righteousness and I don't know what the opposite of humbleness is. What would you say?
Hubris?
Hubris? We
Yeah,
don't know. We are we are not English teachers. None of us are qualified for that. So we're gonna go with hubris. Please cancel me on Twitter if I'm wrong. But I think it leads into, when we talk about sometimes people can be that way, like I said, about asking questions out of ignorance or because they've never heard it before or because they don't understand themselves, that that's where their motivation is. So maybe, when people recognize that in themselves, or maybe sometimes somebody will point it out to them and hopefully they're receptive to that and they can change it. There's nothing wrong with that, because a big part of an ally is making mistakes. A big part of being an ally is making mistakes. So that is a little bit different from what we're going to talk about next, which is purposely being self-righteous, purposely being hurtful. And that is the opposite of being a true ally. It's something that I coin as false allyship. And as I said, this can kind of get tricky because we've established what it means to be a true ally who makes mistakes. And sometimes it's hard to differentiate between that and someone who is being a false ally. And to kind of set up that definition, false allyship is a deliberate attempt to occupy a space in the community with the aim of causing harm. A kind of analogy, I think, would be a wolf in sheep's clothing. It is definitely a big red flag. Definitely not something that is a good thing. And this is not something that, in my personal opinion, is any form of acceptable, and it has nothing to do with being ignorant. It has to do with being hateful and having ill intent. And I want to kind of talk about a scenario that we discussed in the blog. And I'm going to kind of read it. So this is the only part of this episode that I'm kind of going to do my best to read verbatim, because I think this is the best way I can outline it without using a bunch of big words and being confusing. So a scenario would be, let's say we're going to have two characters, John and Joey. And obviously Joey being the gay character in this fanfic of, fiction that does not exist. So here's the scenario. John claims to support a school friend, Joey being gay. He never makes homophobic comments around Joey or bullies him. However, John makes jokes about Joey falling in love with him and acts overly awkward in vulnerable places such as the locker room. Then Joey gets a boyfriend. At this point, John starts asking invasive questions, very sexual questions. Maybe he is always changing the topic very bluntly, very openly when Joey discusses his partner. But maybe John, constantly brings up his girlfriend, but doesn't want Joey to be talking about his boyfriend because he thinks it's gross, and he makes that known. That would be an example of someone who is not really an ally. That would be a false ally, someone whose heart is not in the right place on purpose, because he says that he supported his friend and then his actions do not reflect his words. And with false allyship, that is the number one way to be able to point it out, is not through what someone says, but how it relates to their actions. And there are 3 red flags to look out for when identifying false allyship. The 3 red flags are hypocrisy, situational support, and neutrality. And neutrality does not necessarily mean what neutrality typically means, which is like not having an opinion on whether you support them or not. That's not what I mean. How would you say that you have seen examples of hypocrisy in the ally community?
Okay. Well, before, I'm trying to figure out how to work this in. So in the blog, you gave a really great example where, and I forget their names again, who is the false ally?
The false ally in this situation is John.
Okay, so John is talking with a group of friends and they make a joke that is anti-LGBTQ. And John says nothing. And you gave that as an example of neutrality. And 100% I agree with that. When I was growing up, my mother would say to me, if you're in a group of people and they're talking bad about someone and you don't speak up, it's just as bad as you joining in.
And oh my God, wait, hold on. That reminds me of the John Mulaney skit. I was over on the bench. do you remember that from SNL?
Yeah.
Oh my God, that was so. For those of you who don't know, it was his dad was getting on to him. His friend was being bullied in the park, and they were like, "Why didn't you do anything to stop it, John?" And John goes, "Well, I was over on the bench." So, you guys should look up that skit. It's really funny. Anyways, please continue.
Yeah. So, I will be honest that I don't know, like personally know in my life a ton of people that would say that they are allies of LGBTQ. I know some, but I don't know a lot. And that doesn't mean that people that I know are not supportive. They just don't identify as an ally. They're not like, oh yeah, I'm an ally. I go to Pride or I share news article, whatever. They're just like either the other type of neutral, which is whatever, I don't care. That's their life. This is my life. Or, they are supportive, but there's no action behind that. So what I can say is I have met, and I do know a couple of people who are allies, but then, maybe they themselves make jokes that are inappropriate and they're like, oh, I'm just kidding because, I have a cousin who's gay, or I have, a daughter who's a lesbian or whatever, but it's still not okay to make those comments or to make jokes, or because it's not funny. But I personally don't have a lot of experience with hypocrisy per se, except for that category, which almost I feel falls into neutrality instead. I guess it toes the line. It's on that line, right? Because they say they're an ally, but then with their own mouth, they say things derogatory and try to pass it off as a joke. So I will say that for the most part, individuals that I know to be allies are true allies. Examples of what I would think falls under hypocrisy. Well, the example I just gave, saying one thing and doing one thing when you're with the LGBTQ community, but then, behind closed doors where you think it doesn't matter, you're completely different. Or, and what was the second one? Because I've already talked about neutrality.
Yes. So the second one I feel like is the more common way that you can identify false allyship, because it is very prominent in the world in general, which is situational support, where sometimes you are supportive, sometimes you're not. And my favorite example is always like, oh, if you want to be, like you can choose, which you can't, but that's the rhetoric. So let's say, oh, you want to be gay, but don't be gay around me. I'm paraphrasing the words of someone who's a false ally. I would never say that to anybody, but kind of the situation of, well, you can be gay and date other guys, but if you have a crush on me, I'm going to be grossed out. Like, that is homophobic, and that is a false ally. Even if if you don't like that person, if you are straight, you can just kindly turn them down. If you really are supportive of the gay community, of the LGBTQ community as a whole, you do not need to be making those comments, because you should not care that they like you. You should just turn them down gently.
Yeah.
But
Well,
yeah.
also, there are individuals who are like, well, that's fine as long as it's not in my backyard. Or like in the example you gave where, uh, they're like, oh yes, I support you. I'm your friend, whatever. I don't have an issue with it, but yet they are openly uncomfortable about conversation. I mean, me, I do not talk about like my marriage or my husband to other people. I keep that to very minimal conversation. I can't imagine like being at work and just exposing all kinds of personal information about my private life with my husband. But if I say, oh, which it is it's my wedding anniversary, and someone says, congratulations, I would fully expect that if this were, someone in the LGBTQ community and it was like their anniversary, which this has happened, I should also give that congratulations, that's so awesome. And it needs to be reciprocated conversation. And I think if it's like, it's okay for me to talk about my relationship, and it's okay for me to talk about this or that, but I don't want to hear it from you, then that falls under a false ally. That openly being uncomfortable. You don't have to fully, I was talking to my husband about this yesterday, actually, is, as we mentioned, we're talking about earlier, the definitions, there are more now than there were when I was growing up. And it doesn't mean that I can be an ally for LGBTQ and not fully relate to or understand different, like I can be educated on what the different identifications are, But that doesn't mean that, it's wrong to have questions, or it's, and that it's okay that I don't fully relate to this identification or that. But where it's wrong, in my opinion, say, yes, I'm an ally of LGBTQ, but I don't understand trans, or I don't understand gay, or, whatever, like picking out one piece of that and saying, well, I don't understand it. And I don't mean understand in the sense of like, you're not educated. You're an ally, you're educated, and you're like, yeah, but I don't really understand that. It's a whole community and it's all equal. So we have to love and respect and understand everyone. It doesn't mean that we relate to everyone on an individual basis 100%, but we don't do that as a human species anyway. And, like, I cannot relate to a mother who has lost their child. That's what I mean. There's all types of examples out there, but I can relate to a birth mother who, you know, went through an adoption process. So that's what I mean. We can educate ourselves and be an ally. And then where it becomes dangerous and almost that you might not be a true ally is if it's like, I like all of that except that. I don't understand that. I don't accept that. But all this is okay. I think to be an effective ally, everyone's on the same playing field. It's completely equal. Love is love. So
Yes. I think all of those situations and examples were good points. Um, I want to kind of ask you in terms of, you know, when you start seeing signs of a false ally, this is not something that was discussed in the blog, and I thought it was more beneficial to have this in an open discussion. If you were to maybe recognize someone who is displaying hypocrisy or neutrality or perhaps situational support, how would you broach that topic with them? How would you address coming into contact with a false ally? Because I think a lot of the times, a lot of people are non-confrontational, and that is understandable. A lot of people have anxiety. I'm not bashing that. But if you had the opportunity to say something to someone who was displaying those traits, how would you go about doing that while
mm,
not cutting them off from maybe one day realizing, like what you said, love is love, and maybe coming around because people's mindsets can change? So how would you approach the topic without maybe wishing that, making them want to never come back, or, you know, not just blatantly insulting them, but giving them advice?
yeah, I mean, that's tough. And I I could probably use advice on that because, as I mentioned earlier, I don't have the greatest filter, but I never intend. Um, I do not like confrontation, but I will be confrontational where I feel it's necessary. And in that type of situation, I would feel it's necessary, but I would have to step back and really think about um, what was said or what was done, and basically formulate a response. I do think it would need to be a face to face conversation, which is hard to do these days. So, if possible, a face to face, because things can be lost in translation on social media or texting someone. And, when you're talking about calling someone out on something, there are times and places to do that, like social media and text, I think is fine for certain situations where you do believe you can get your point across calmly and clearly. But something like that, I could see someone who is a false ally, feeling attacked. And like you said, they wouldn't want to be a part of, uh, the community anymore, or be an ally anymore, or whatever. And so for me personally, I would have to step back, really think about my response, um, and then try to have a face-to-face conversation and just let them know, like, listen, I believe your intentions are good, and I don't know if you realize that when you said this, or you did this, it came across as, really the opposite of what I think you're wanting to put out there as an ally. And maybe starting the conversation in that way, just so that they don't immediately feel on blast. But I'm also, again, I'm non-confrontational. So I think I'm probably one that could use some advice in that area, and not really a great one to give advice in that area.
You know what? That's completely fair. And to you and to anyone listening who thinks they will or could benefit from advice on addressing false allyship, I want to say put your mental health first. What our guest just said about stepping back and formulating a response, that is taking care of her anxiety and making sure that she's in a good mental space to be confronting people who are going to probably respond negatively, because even if they didn't have bad intentions, human beings as a general population don't like to be told that they're doing something wrong, and don't like to have their words misinterpreted, or just don't like to be called out in general. But sometimes it's
Mhm.
necessary. So the first piece of advice would be, to just look out for your mental health if you're not in a safe environment to call out someone. For example, if you're at a family dinner and you're surrounded by a bunch of people who are homophobic or transphobic or just anti-LGBT in general, maybe seek support afterwards if you feel like their comments or mannerisms or behaviors, or if you recognize a family member who is being a false ally and claiming that they are, but not acting like it. If you don't feel safe, do not confront them, and seek support afterwards with your friends, a counselor, someone you trust, and talk it out with them, and don't hold it inside, because that will only it won't solve the problem, and it's not beneficial to you or to anybody else in that situation. But
Mhm.
if you do feel like you're in a safe place, and you do feel like, and by safe place I mean physically and mentally, to be
Mhm.
clear. But if you do feel like you're in a good headspace and you are in a safe, comfortable environment, I would say be very calm about it. And, I don't consider myself a confrontational person, but I don't consider myself somebody who doesn't seek out conflict sometimes. And I guess seek out conflict wouldn't be a good word, right? It would be more of like, I do not like, I don't take kindly to being put down. I stand up for myself, and everyone should be standing up for themselves. So don't let yourself be walked over because you're scared of conflict. And to do that, I would say walk up to them, or if you're sitting down, address them, and maybe don't call them out in front of everybody. Maybe pull them aside. Maybe make it a more private situation. And have that conversation in a calm manner. And if they get agitated or defensive, don't get agitated and defensive right back. Don't match that energy, okay? Keep to your own vibes, and, keep to your own atmosphere, and stay as a, cool and level-headed. And if they don't respond nicely, and if they don't, go, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize that I was doing that, and try and make amends in some way, and instead choose to insult you or accuse you of something that you're not doing, such as calling them a liar, um, which is called gaslighting, as we mentioned before. If you don't know what that term means, please Google it, because I am not a mental health professional and I'm not qualified to explain that in enough words. But the important thing is, if they start doing those things, realize that you don't have to take that personally. That's them feeling cornered. You would react the same way if you were feeling confronted by something that you didn't do, because in their minds, everyone has a different world and everyone lives a different experience. So if they react negatively, that's not a reflection on you, and it's most likely not a reflection on your approach. If you take this advice, it is a reflection of them being uncomfortable and being called out, maybe being embarrassed. And this is where, I would say that I don't, in my head, I do not try and seek out conflict, because I feel like if you're insulting an entire community when love is love and people just love people, maybe that's what they need to feel a little bit embarrassed. So don't feel bad. Don't blame yourself if they respond negatively. Sometimes people just need to be told straight up that what you're doing is not acceptable in any way, shape, or form. And you as a human being have the right to stand up for yourself. And as an ally or as a member of the LGBTQ community, you almost have a responsibility to do it, not just for yourself, but for the community at large, because you're not the only person that will be interacting with this false ally in the future. And if you have a safe environment and a good mental space, do it for those who don't have a safe environment, those who don't have a safe mental space. So that's going kind of off the topic of being a false ally. That's something to keep in mind as an ally, is even if you may not feel like it's your place to defend the LGBTQ community, it is, because you are our supporter and you are fighting alongside us for equality, and fighting for our equality in mental health and in education and in society. So never feel like it's not your place to stand up for us, because it is actually more than just your place. It is one of your responsibilities, which we will discuss more in part 2. So I think we've extensively covered most of what we wanted to cover today in part 1, and the rest of it will be in the second part of this episode, with a different special guest that I'm really excited to introduce to everybody. She's representing New York. We're representing Florida. She's representing New York, the Bronx. So really excited to kind of have her on. And thank you so much for coming on today and representing the community of allies. And thank you so much for being a true ally and being supportive of me and my journey. And I'm really excited that Pride is coming back this year, because all the COVID stuff, and we definitely need to go again. And if you're in Florida, I'm not being paid commission to say this, go to St. Pete Pride, go. Like if you're like, should I go? Yes. The answer is yes. Go. So obviously, if you have the means, but do you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to add?
I do not. I think this was a very good conversation, as all of our conversations are. And, thank you for being, so patient, and you are so well spoken and an open communicator. To me, yes, I am your mother, but there are a lot
Disclaimer,
of things.
anything she says should be pretense, but she is my mother.
But that being said, you have educated me on a lot of things, and you have pushed me to grow. And my motto for work is be more, do more, grow more. And I think that is something we can all use in our everyday lives. Learn more about what's going on around us, be more of an advocate, be more of an ally, and do more, find ways to get active. And even if you can't physically go be active, there's ways to be a good ally by sharing information on social media, or writing letters to those in government against policies that are, or laws that are being proposed, that sort of stuff. So, so again, thank you. Thank you for having me on. It was a great experience. It's my first podcast ever. So.
Oh my God. Yes. And if you guys are kind of in that situation where you can't advocate from home, can't advocate outside of your home, and you want to advocate from your home, you can be a guest on, you can join the Comcast. If you are wondering, I'm a huge Broadway fan. So everyone who comes on here is more than a guest. They are part of my cast and crew. So you can join and come on as a guest. You just need to fill out the entrance form on the website at there's 3 W's, right? In a website, www.thecomblog.com. It's a really simple URL. If you want to read the blog, that is the outline for this episode, you can also view that on our website. I would also recommend you go and follow us on social media. On Instagram, our handle is the.com.blog, all lowercase. It's a horrible Instagram handle, but somebody already took the com blog, so it's what we're working with. It's what we're feeling in this moment. So you can go ahead and follow us on there to keep up with all the latest updates. And that is really all I have to say. Don't forget, you can get service learning hours for continuing to listen to the podcast. And don't forget to check out part 2 of this episode. And that's all we have today. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.